Welcome back, true believers and spectacular Spidey fans, to another really exciting episode of Spider-Man PS4 101. So recently we have received a lot of really interesting info relating to Marvel's Spider-Man, as well as what we can expect in the upcoming DLC and even the potential sequel. And if you're wondering where all this info is coming from, it mainly relates to the amazing interview that Brian Intar participated in from fellow YouTuber Spider-Man Crawlspace. And basically, Brian Intar partook in an hour-long interview with this amazing YouTuber, and if you want to see the full interview for yourself, I will leave it as a link in the description below. But in this video, I'm going to mainly point out all the main highlights that came out of this awesome interview. And starting off with the first piece of info that Brian discussed during this interview is relating to the second piece of the City That Never Sleeps DLC of Turf Wars. So Brian did actually mention Turf Wars a couple of times during this interview, and as we know already, it is indeed going to arrive sometime this month in November, but Brian was implying that it may arrive sooner than we think.
The Black Cat DLC is out now.
Yeah,
so you can
and
download that.
Force coming out soon, very soon, and then after that, Silver Lining. So it's going to be a very big fall of Spider-Man. So it's going to be pretty fun. So if you haven't, and the great thing is, you can. It kind of continues the story for where we went with Spider-Man 1, so definitely finish up that game and you won't have any spoilers when you start Black Cat.
And as for the main point of discussion that a lot of people are talking about relating to this particular piece of DLC is none other than the upcoming suits that we are going to have within it. And as we already know, Brian's favorite suit within the entirety of the City That Never Sleeps DLC pack is indeed within Turf Wars, but he actually expanded upon this within the interview.
There are more suits on the way, and I think people are in for some really cool surprises. My favorite suit has yet to be revealed, and it's coming out in the next DLC in Turf Wars. My favorite, and it's not one that I was hoping for, but when I saw it designed, it quickly became my favorite.
There's a tease. I like that.
Yeah.
So given Brian's phrasing during this statement, the least that we can conclude about his favorite suit within Turf Wars is that it is not an Insomniac design or a movie costume, but rather some form of a comic book suit. And yes, I know a lot of people want the Sam Raimi suit to be featured within Spider-Man PS4 one way or another, and even though it may not appear within Turf Wars, there is still a chance it could appear within Silver Lining. But still, we'll just have to wait and see what Brian's favorite suit is within Turf Wars, but given what he said, I'm really excited to see what it is. Now, the next highlight during this interview is the discussion of a certain villain that is heavily teased during the end of Spider-Man PS4, and that is, of course, Green Goblin. So as we see throughout the main game, there are a ton of references to Norman Osborn potentially becoming the Green Goblin within some point in a sequel to Spider-Man PS4. However, one statement that Spider-Man Crawlspace discussed during the interview is that he does not want to see the ultimate rendition of Green Goblin in any way, shape, or form, and instead would rather like to see the standard 616 iteration of Green Goblin with the classic glider that we all know him from.
As a fan of most of the Ultimate Spider-Man, please don't make the Goblin Big Hulk like they have in the Into the Spider-Verse. I love Norman just crazy, not a big Hulk, but that's just a personal opinion. YouTubers.
So even though there are a lot of winks and nods throughout the main game of Norman becoming the standard Green Goblin with the glider instead of the ultimate version of Green Goblin, you never know if Insomniac may or may not do some narrative twists with the character. For example, since we saw Harry teased to becoming Venom within the sequel of the game instead of Eddie Brock, there still could be a chance that Norman may or may not turn to the ultimate Green Goblin instead of the classic one. But still, we'll just have to wait and see where Insomniac goes on that front, but I'm pretty sure they are going to go with the standard Green Goblin that we all know and love. And moving on to quite a few highlights that were brought up during this interview is where Brian and Spider-Man Crawlspace were discussing a lot about certain comic book iterations of very popular Spider-Man characters. And the main three characters that they were discussing about during the interview is Venom, Gwen Stacy, and Kraven the Hunter. So during the interview, Brian was asked what some of his favorite Spider-Man stories are from the comics, and the main three that he mentioned are indeed the ultimate story relating to Venom, as well as the death of Gwen Stacy and Kraven's last hunt. And the first reason is obvious since it relates to Venom and how it's more than likely that he is going to be the main villain of the inevitable sequel. And even more so, there is a huge Easter egg during the Mary Jane mission where you are exploring the secret lab in Norman's penthouse relating to Venom directly. So as we know throughout the game, Devil's Breath is known as GR27 for the proper term of it, and it's also known as the Martin Lee incident that we see in the secret laboratory. And the reason why the number 35 is so important is because the 35th issue of the Ultimate Spider-Man comics was indeed the very first appearance of the ultimate version of Venom.
I really love the way that the Ultimate Spider-Man handled the Venom storyline.
And seeing how Ultimate Venom is indeed one of my favorite versions of the character, either from the comics that he was based from or the video game that he was involved with of Ultimate Spider-Man, I really hope that Insomniac can take a lot of inspiration from this iteration of the character and involve him in a really great way in the inevitable sequel. And seeing how Venom is most likely going to be Harry Osborn instead of Eddie Brock, that's just going to make it even more exciting to see it be played out. Now, as for Gwen Stacy being name dropped during this interview, this is actually way more important than it seems to be.
The death of Gwen Stacy is one of my favorites.
And the reason being is because if you read the prequel novel to Marvel's Spider-Man of Hostile Takeover, you would know that Gwen Stacy is actually teased to be alive within this game's universe. And even though Peter already has his fair share of love interests within the main game of Mary Jane and even Felicia Hardy, I do think it would be really cool if they included Gwen Stacy in the potential sequel. And seeing how we're also most likely going to get Green Goblin in a future game, if we were to experience the death of Gwen Stacy in the potential sequel, that would be absolutely insane. Spider-Man PS4's main story was filled with emotional moments like the final boss battle against Dr. Octopus, as well as experiencing Aunt May's death. And if we were to actually experience the death of Gwen Stacy in the potential sequel to Spider-Man PS4, that would be insanely emotional to go through. And seeing how well the writing team handled Spider-Man PS4's main story, I have no doubt that the sequel's narrative would be just as good, if not better, than the main game. And as for the last important character that Brian mentioned is Kraven the Hunter himself. So there's nothing too exciting about Brian discussing Kraven the Hunter, but what I do find intriguing is how often he mentions him during the interview.
Kraven's Last Hunt is fantastic, right?
Oh, yeah.
We don't have Kraven in the game, but just like in terms of like, to me, it really showed how much you can make a character very emotional and have really complex motivations, which is great about Kraven. And I think that's one of the reasons why that story, to me, it's really about a story about Kraven. It's not a story about Spider-Man at the end of the day. And I think that all the classics that people love, and then probably some surprises. Actually, Kraven was really never considered for Spider-Man.
Okay.
It wasn't really working with the game that we were making. But there's a ton of, obviously he's got a lot of great villains. There was never we don't have enough characters to choose from.
Yeah, he's got one of the best rogues gallery of all time.
And the same thing goes for Kraven just as it does for Venom and Green Goblin. If we were to get a sequel of Spider-Man PS4 and Kraven would somehow be implemented within the game, I have no doubt that Insomniac would handle his character in an extremely innovative and intriguing way. And speaking of villains that may appear in the sequel or even the upcoming DLC is actually relating to the one and only Martin Lee himself, Mr. Negative. So one of the biggest questions that was left unanswered at the end of Spider-Man PS4 is after we defeat Martin Lee, we just see him get attacked by Doc Ock, and that's the last we ever see of him in the game. So the main question is, where did Martin Lee go after he was attacked by Dr. Octopus? Did he die, flee New York, or did he just end up getting locked in the raft? And this is what Brian had to say relating to that question.
What happened to Martin Lee at the end of the game? Did he get recaptured, or is he still at large?
You'll find out, maybe.
So given Brian's answer and the status of Mr. Negative's whereabouts, if we were to see him return in the sequel or even in some DLC, I would have no problem with that whatsoever. Mr. Negative was one of my favorite villains throughout Spider-Man PS4's story, and if we were to see him return in any way, I would be super down for that. But still, we'll just have to wait and see if that does turn out to be the case. And moving on to the second to last highlight is pretty much Brian fully implying that we will indeed be visiting a location that was referenced within the Heist DLC of Marvel's Spider-Man. And this actually doubles down on my theory that I had in another video that we will indeed be going to the bar with no name, either upcoming in Turf Wars or Silver Lining. And if you didn't know, there was indeed an update to the exterior design of the bar with no name's door with a security pad attached to the outside of it. And given Brian's coy response to the bar with no name location precisely during this interview, I do think that this confirms that we will be going inside of it either in Turf Wars or Silver Lining.
We actually saw the bar with no name in the game.
Yeah.
Will we be able to go into the bar and maybe see Boomerang, or that would just be a fun little mission. That would be a fun thing to go into that bar.
It's an interesting idea.
Yeah, there you go.
And seeing how we already entered the Manhattan Museum of Contemporary Art in the Heist, I'm really excited to see the interior of this location within the upcoming DLC. And as for the very last highlight of this interview is relating to none other than one of the best Spider-Man villains out there of Cletus Cassidy himself, aka Carnage.
Too late to ask Brian about any love for Cletus Cassidy.
I don't know. I don't know right now.
Now, since it's already heavily teased that we're going to receive Venom as the main antagonist of Spider-Man PS4 sequel, another villain that a lot of people want to see is Carnage. And as all of us comic fans know, each of our favorite characters always seem to have a different incarnation of them within different comics, and the same thing applies for Carnage. There's primarily the main version of Carnage of Cletus Cassidy, who is a serial killer who bonds with the offspring of the Venom symbiote. Or there's also the bloodthirsty version of Carnage from the Ultimate Comics, which just ends up being a deformed clone of Peter Parker's blood. And seeing how Insomniac may take a lot of inspiration from the Ultimate Comics relating to Venom, that may be the same case for their version of Carnage if they do have him in the sequel or another game in the future. In the end, if awesome characters like Gwen Stacy, Kraven the Hunter, Venom, and Carnage will appear in the upcoming Spider-Man games that Insomniac will develop, I can guarantee you this is going to be one heck of a fun time. And with all that said, everyone, that's the news I have for you today, and please let me know all your thoughts in the comments section down below. What did you think of the full interview that Spider-Man Crawlspace had with Brian Intar, and which piece of info excited you the most? For me, even though I'm really excited to see what Brian's favorite suit is within Turf Wars, I can't wait to see Insomniac's version of Venom and hopefully Carnage. But anyways, guys, thank you all so much for watching. Stay spectacular, Spidey fans. Peace out.
What was that? What's happening? Oh my God. I know. You! Parker!
Hell yes.